notions of trying to understand the system of capitalism have actually have re-entered. I mean, they've never really went away, but have really re-entered, trying to have a systemic understanding. And that's what your latest big book is about, in some sense. I really love the way you begin it by discussing the fact that there are moments of order and disorder that are central to the capitalist path, and that there's an alternative way of conceptualizing capitalism as a turbulent system, and a gravitation around certain fixed points. So maybe you could just walk us a little bit through this vision of capitalism and why you think it's really important in an alternative path.
Yes, thank you. The book is my attempt to put together the results of what started off as my archaeological excavations of the classical tradition, but eventually had to develop, as you mentioned, the theory of trade is nowhere present really except verbally in Smith, and Ricardo's theory, I believe, is false. Theory of money, theory of interest and finance. There's little discussion of the stock market in any of that literature. And of course, most fundamentally, the theory of aggregate demand is implicit perhaps, but is not explicit in any of that. So I had to put together a coherent argument, and I took it upon myself to not only do that, but how would I know that it was coherent without testing it against the data? So part of what took so long for the book was the development of the empirical side. If I have different categories, I have to develop the measures of these categories. Sometimes, as I said, with capital stock, that took a long time. With trade, it took a long time. But one can do it. And the book then has 3 elements to it. One is that we can explain what is called in microeconomics the positive theory of consumer behavior, which is demand curves, demand elasticities, the income elasticity of a necessary good being less than 1, of a luxury being greater than 1. These observed patterns, we can develop them without any reference whatsoever to utility, optimizing, rational choice, or any of that, because they depend on something much simpler, which is the existence of budget constraints, which we all face in some limits in some way, and the fact that a collective behavior of individuals will effectively pick a point on the budget constraint. Now, that understanding comes from Gary Becker, because in 1963, Becker showed that you can derive the fundamental results of micro without requiring utility theory. And I was in his course when he gave that lecture, and it blew me away, because I realized there was a foundation that I could use to develop consumer theory. And then it's enough to say that people have many multiple determinations. In the individual level, they may act in ways that are either repetitive or not. It doesn't matter. As long as the stochastic whole has a kind of stable mean, all the results will follow. And to show that first part in the book, I do agent-based simulation of 4 different types of individuals. One, I complete neoclassical consumers who are identical, so it's the paradigmatic neoclassical case. Neoclassical consumers who are different, so that there's no such thing as a representative agent anymore. Random choice, which is Becker's impulsive consumer, and idea that we take from Giovanni Dossi, which is that people react to their environment around them. So we have 2 sets of consumers, one who look around, so to speak, to see what others are doing and adapt in their local neighborhood, and the others who do the opposite. So we call this imitate and innovate. The ones who do the opposite change their behavior, and the ones who imitate also change their behavior, but one moves towards the center and the other away from it. I think in retrospect, in my life, I think of those as older people and younger people, but it may not be true. It depends on the time in history. So that allowed me to say that we have a coherent micro-foundations for the consumer. And then the other theme is the idea of competition, of firms, how the behavior of firms. And to sort of compress it very much, firms are strongly disciplined by the mobility of capital, which equalizes profit rates. But I think my innovation there, my addition to that understanding, was the explanation that the profit rates that have to be equalized would be not on older capitals, older plant and equipment, but obviously on new investment. Because if you're going to enter an industry, you're going to enter with the best methods that you can, and that means your investment will be focused on those methods. in the literature that's often called the best practice technique. That has an implication, and that implication is that capital will flow, investment will flow from one sector to another according to the rates of return on new investment, and therefore competition will equalize rates of return on new investment. Now again, that took me roughly 10 years to figure out how to move to the empirical stage, but then I was able to show that indeed the rate of return on new investment is empirically equalized. And we can therefore derive many propositions about interest rates, stock market. I show the rate of return. The stock market very closely follows the rate of return on new investment in the corporate sector. That allows me to address Shiller's argument about irrational behavior, irrational exuberance, which I show is not true. But that also provides another interesting point. This measure of the rate of return on new investment happens to be exactly what Keynes calls the marginal efficiency of investment. And that means that the theory of real competition that I developed for the firm also provides an explanation for the determination of the marginal efficiency of capital, the ex post efficiency. And that then leads as a point of entry into the theory of effective demand, because Keynes says it's driven by the expectation of the rate of return on new investment. But of course, that expectation must be disciplined by the actual result. If you are wrong, then you pull your expectation back. If you're right, you push it forward. And there I needed a theoretical understanding of the relation between the expectation and the real. And I found that in the work of George Soros, in the idea of reflexivity. And as you see, when I'm building these framework, I'm building a map in my head. It's a jigsaw puzzle. So as I fit in this puzzle, I see the whole has to have this shape. I need something there, but I don't know where it is. And I have to either construct it or see if there's an argument. And I found in Soros's work an exact explanation for this missing point in Keynesian theory, which is that you can expect something. It can actually change the actual results. But the fundamentals exert a kind of steady gravitational influence. And as the actual results get further away from the fundamentals, this gap makes more and more people nervous. And then they switch over. As they start to get out, then the expectation switches and the actual begins to fall. And so the real underlying process regulates. So then I have a theory in which profitability plays a central role all the way through. Consumers get their income from wages. Nobody gives wages unless you expect to make profits from it. Businesses sell intermediate goods, again, based on the expectation of using them. And so this provides an explanation of the consumer behavior root, which is the income of consumers, wages, profits, rents, and interest, and also aggregate demand and the movement of individual firms. And that I felt at that point, this was about 5 years ago, that I had more or less the foundations and I needed to start finishing up. I mean, I've been working on this book for 15 years in this version of it, and I began to sort of write my way to the end, hoping to get to the end before I personally fell apart.